The Supreme Court has struck down former President Donald Trump's proposed universal 10% tariff on all imported goods, calling it an unconstitutional overreach of executive authority. This July 2025 decision does more than resolve a legal dispute. It redefines the limits of presidential power and the future of American trade. The case, U.S. Chamber of Commerce vs. United States, pitted the executive's claim to regulate foreign commerce for national security against Congress's constitutional authority to levy taxes. Unlike targeted tariffs, Trump's proposal was a sweeping tax on nearly every product entering the U.S., raising profound legal and economic questions. The ruling removes the threat of higher costs for American businesses and signals a return to more predictable global trade relationships. Supporters of the tariff see the decision as a setback for protecting American jobs, while critics hail it as a victory for constitutional checks and balances. The debate now shifts from the White House to Congress, as the nation considers its economic identity and the balance of power in government. Free trade advocates and legal scholars praise the decision for preserving congressional authority, while economic nationalists condemn it as a blow to presidential power. Markets have responded positively, but the long-term political consequences remain uncertain. This moment forces the U.S. to confront fundamental questions about its role in the global economy and the structure of its democracy. The story of this tariff is ultimately about the very framework of American governance. Trump's universal tariff was the boldest expression of his America First agenda, meant to make imports more expensive and boost domestic manufacturing. He argued it would revive factories, create jobs, and shrink the trade deficit, framing it as a patriotic duty rather than a tax. The policy was also a geopolitical statement, designed to force trading partners to renegotiate deals and bring critical industries back to U.S. soil. Supporters saw it as a long-overdue correction for decades of globalization that hurt American workers. The estimated $300 billion in annual revenue was touted as a way to fund tax cuts or pay down the debt. The plan was intentionally disruptive, with advisors arguing that short-term pain would lead to long-term industrial renewal. By applying the tariff universally, it avoided claims of discrimination and sent a clear message. The old rules of global trade no longer applied. Critics, however, warned of higher prices and global retaliation. The policy was a fight for the American worker against globalist elites, but it risked economic shock. America First under this vision meant reshaping the world order on U.S. terms. The universal tariff proposal ignited fierce debate, dividing not just parties but entire communities. Populist Republicans and some labor unions supported it, hoping for job security and a manufacturing revival. Business groups, mainstream Republicans, Democrats, and farmers opposed it, warning of higher prices and devastating export losses. Proponents used patriotic messaging, promising a return to prosperity and dismissing inflation fears as globalist propaganda. Critics, including Nobel-winning economists, predicted recession and job losses, highlighting the complexity of modern supply chains. Consumer groups warned families would pay more for everyday goods. The debate became a clash of visions, one seeking protection and self-reliance, the other embracing global engagement and free trade. Television ads and social media campaigns amplified both sides, fueling a national conversation about fairness and the future. The tariff debate exposed deep anxieties about globalization and economic change. Ultimately, it was a battle over what kind of country America wants to be. Business groups led by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce quickly sued to block the tariff, arguing it was an unconstitutional tax only Congress could impose. The lawsuit centered on the separation of powers, with plaintiffs claiming the president overstepped by imposing a sweeping tax via executive order. They argued that while presidents have some authority for targeted tariffs, a universal tariff far exceeded any delegated power. The administration countered that national security justified the move, citing broad executive authority under existing trade laws. The legal fight became a test of where regulatory fees end and taxes begin, and who gets to decide. Procedural arguments about lack of economic analysis and public comment gave courts another reason to scrutinize the policy. The stage was set for a constitutional showdown over the limits of presidential power. The legal battle began in D.C. District Court, where business groups won a preliminary injunction halting the tariff. The judge found the tariff likely unconstitutional, emphasizing that only Congress can impose such a broad tax. The government appealed, but the D.C. Circuit upheld the injunction, focusing on the founders' intent to keep taxing power in the legislature. Amicus briefs from legal scholars and trade experts underscored the case's national importance. With lower courts aligned against the policy, the government petitioned the Supreme Court for a final decision. The justices agreed to an expedited review, recognizing the urgent need for clarity. The stage was set for a historic Supreme Court ruling on executive authority. On July 27, 2025, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 to block the universal tariff, declaring the executive cannot unilaterally impose such a sweeping tax. The majority opinion affirmed that Congress alone holds the power to tax, and that national security concerns cannot override constitutional boundaries. The court distinguished this tariff from targeted measures, calling its scope a general revenue-raising action reserved for Congress. Dissenting justices argued the decision hamstrung the president's ability to protect American industries. The ruling is a major check on presidential power, clarifying that broad tariffs require explicit congressional approval. It reaffirms Congress's primary role in economic policy and the separation of powers. For future presidents, the message is clear. Sweeping trade actions need legislative backing. The decision is a landmark for American checks and balances. The Supreme Court's decision sparked immediate polarized reactions at home and abroad. U.S. allies welcomed the ruling as a return to stable, rules-based trade, easing fears of a global trade war. Business groups and free trade advocates celebrated, calling it a victory for consumers and economic stability. Wall Street rallied, and agricultural groups breathed a sigh of relief as the threat of retaliatory tariffs faded. Tariff supporters, including Trump, condemned the decision as a betrayal of American workers and a win for globalists. Populist politicians vowed to push Congress for new tariff authority. Public opinion was mixed. Most Americans favored the ruling to avoid higher prices, but manufacturing regions voiced disappointment. The verdict dominated news cycles, fueling debate over trade, jobs, and the Constitution. The fight over protectionism is far from over. It has simply moved from the courts to Congress. The ruling ensures trade policy will remain a central political issue for years to come. The Supreme Court's decision triggered a surge in financial markets, with stocks in import-heavy sectors and major retailers jumping. Economic forecasts had warned the tariff would shrink GDP, cost millions of jobs, and raise household expenses by over $1,000 a year. The ruling erased these dire predictions, prompting economists and the Federal Reserve to revise outlooks upward. Businesses resumed investment and hiring, relieved by the return of predictability. However, the underlying issues, trade deficits, struggling manufacturing towns, and unfair foreign practices, remain unresolved. The verdict prevents one policy but doesn't solve the deeper challenges facing American workers. Economists note that while the tariff was flawed, the problems it targeted are real and persistent. The debate over how to support U.S. industries in a global market continues. The decision brought clarity to markets but not to the nation's economic future. The search for effective solutions is far from over. The Supreme Court's rejection of the universal tariff is a defining moment for American democracy and trade. By reaffirming Congress's authority over broad-based taxes, the court reinforced the separation of powers and checked executive overreach. The ruling stabilizes trade policy, but the core tensions between protectionism and global engagement remain unresolved. The decision reassures allies and markets, but manufacturing decline and trade deficits still fuel political pressure. America stands at a crossroads, forced to rethink its economic strategy and global role. The verdict closes one chapter but opens another, demanding new solutions and consensus. The nation must now balance global integration with the needs of its workers. The future of American trade and presidential power remains an open question.